use this.
Thanks. So we'll sit on this side, you sit on that side. Do you need this?
No, I don't.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
just turned on the projector.
So since there's an audience here, we should probably be clear about some ground rules. Is that the primary thing that we need to do today is to examine this thesis. And so Professor Lacey and I, after Rio gives us an introduction and maybe something else to chew on that we hadn't thought of, we have some questions for him. Then when we're finished with that, we'll open it up if you guys have any questions or comments. We could welcome those for however long it seems reasonable. And then everyone will leave the room except Professor Lacey and I, and we'll speak to the question of whether it passes or not. Don't get nervous about it. No pressure.
We have
Yeah.
a pretty good feel.
We have a pretty good feel. So, all yours.
Great. So, May of 2011, Steve Bach was elected the first strong mayor of Colorado Springs following the November charter change. It changed the city from its 90-year plan as a city manager style after the big economic depression in 2009 that caused a whole city uproar. Now, Colorado Springs has often looked throughout its history at charter changes, situations. There's essentially been two reasons throughout its history for changing the charter: to improve the city because in words of efficiency, and to fix problems. Can you advance the slide?
We've got a slide wrangler.
Words wouldn't reach.
Oh, yeah. We had that discussion.
That's actually what I've already covered.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah, and I'll go back to that. Colorado Springs Strong Mayor. Why is it working? This is my honors thesis presentation, and I'm Rio Jordan. You want to advance the slide one more time? So here's what we'll be looking at. What are these two systems? What's a mayor council? What's a council manager? How has the system been looked at? System changes in general looked at throughout Colorado Springs history, from its first home rule charter to the present, to this new strong mayor charter. So why was the new system adopted, as I've already addressed? I also want to look at two case studies, what I'm calling the Memorial Hospital problem and the Stormwater Task Force, two situations that exemplify what the new character of the city government is after the charter change. Also look at what future proposals are going to happen to the system and flaws and potential solutions. So these here are charts showing how the systems work. So I'll start with the council manager. I call it a straight line model. The people elect a city council. The council selects a city manager who runs the city. They select the department people, and the city council can remove that person if they're not doing their job, or if they feel public sentiment doesn't like how they're doing their job. There's also the mayor council model that was switched to in 2010, first election in 2011. It's more of a split system. It's a separation of powers, more like the federal government in the United States. You have the people who elect both a city council and a mayor. They have checks on each other. The mayor can veto council's decisions. The council can override and often has the ability to support or deny their appointments to various positions. The mayor then acts like the city manager does in the other system and runs the city administration in general, often with the help of a chief of staff or a city administrator. So I wanted to go through what are the common wisdom for the pros and cons. These were a lot of things that were collected by Svara in his book on city governments. So this is on the council manager system. Pros: city council creates policy, and they oversee this administration. It's still an oversight function and accountability function. The idea is the city manager isn't going to have a political function. The city manager is going to look at what's the best way to run the city. It's going to be professional. It's going to go to conferences, figure out, is this way we're doing things right? Is this way we're doing things right? They look at a cumulative view of the city. The other idea is that the city managers, what the decisions they make are going to reflect the city better because it's a whole council that selects that person. The council elected potentially by district representatives and at-large people, depending on the exact setup, versus a mayor who's selected just by the general population. Additionally, there is no term limits or potential for re-election for the city manager. They don't have to worry about public opinion other than how they're doing their job. So they can develop long-term plans and carry them out based on, well, their long-term plan, how many years. They could be in office for 20 years, and sometimes they are. Cons. Mayor in this system is either elected to the council or selected by the council, and that mayor is seen as a figurehead. They don't have any more real power than the average council person, except for the ability to preside over that council. The split council. Let's say you've got one side of the council acts one way, the other acts the other way. It's sort of like Congress right now, or before this election, it was deadlock. You couldn't get anything done because no one could agree. In a situation like that, the city manager can gain more power because no one can agree to remove them if they're overstepping. Accountability is another con in this case. It shows up on both sides, but the idea is you can't just remove the one person you think is doing badly. You have to keep them accountable through all council members. Additionally, the manager being professional sometimes can get over-focused on efficiency. Now, that is not looking at what the community wants, but how to make things run best. They might cut something like parks because we don't really need to spend money on that. Better to save the taxpayers money, even if the public opinion thinks differently. And finally on this list, just because they're a professional does not mean they're competent. It's the council's job to select someone, and they might not do the best job. Can you switch sides? Also want to look at mayor-council system's pros and cons. So, pros. With your mayor-council system, the mayor runs the city. The idea is they provide very strong leadership. This is one person selected by all the people to be the leader. It's like the president in the United States government. They represent the city, they represent the country in that case. In general, and the mayor does the same thing. This is the guy you look to when you think, want to get something done? Who do I contact? Oh, the mayor, not a group of council members. The mayor can have an agenda that allows major policy things to happen. You can have a mayor who says, we need to change how the city works, and they can run against the current person, win, and change how the city works immediately. While a manager, it'd have to be a council who makes that decision. One of the things that's been brought up is that the mayor can work with the council. They can reward people who support them by helping their areas or not, and provide disincentives to people who don't in order to get their policy done. That's connected to the strong leadership aspect. Additionally, professional staff can fill the same role that the city manager does. They can be professional. They can go to those conferences. They can find out best practices. They don't have to be the city manager who does it. In fact, chief of staff or the chief administrative officer in a lot of these cities fills a similar role to the manager, and it's the mayor just makes sure they do their job right. Already mentioned, voters have one person they can hold accountable. Another thing that can come up, mayor can get too strong. You worry about balance of power, one person becoming a dictator. You can add a staff to the council to give them an ability to counter the mayor if he has too much of a power grab, or to not if that doesn't happen. And of course, ideas, control of the budget by the council can also keep that in check. Cons. With one person elected, you don't generally, again, you don't guarantee their competence by electing one person. The effectiveness of one mayor to the next can vary widely. You don't know if the city's going to consistently run right, because they also have to choose their staff. It's not going to be an effective long-term situation. For cons, also, being a strong leader, you can also see what oftentimes happens is the mayor may try to get more power. Has so much, it's easy to try to think they need more or more influence in certain areas. because the mayor is typically elected for a 4-year period or a longer period of time, you can't just remove them immediately without setting up a recall, unlike the manager. So if the mayor is doing something that the city doesn't like as a whole, you can't get rid of him until the next election cycle. And finally, there's often conflict between the mayor and council, a power struggle trying to, the council has one objective, the mayor has another, you end up with confusion between them. Can you advance this one? Okay, so I want to look at a bit of the history of Colorado Springs Charter so we have an idea of what has happened, what the charter culture has been for the city over the years. So in 1906, the city adopted its first home rule charter. This was done because there's actually conflict with the water department. The hydroelectric company and the city were disagreeing, and it was difficult to actually keep them accountable the way the system was put together. So a group of people who had been selected recommended that a water board, a group of people who understand the situation, would be a good way to make sure those relations work properly and that the water department isn't, the hydroelectric company isn't causing problems. The problem was you couldn't do that under the Colorado Constitution. It didn't allow the city to make that modification without adopting a charter. So in 1906, by an election of the people, they adopted what was called the commission system. And the commission system is similar to the manager system, but instead of having one manager who controls the city, you remove the manager, and each council member controls a different department. So you have a council member who controls Parks and Recreation. And in this situation, the focus on water was so great, they put the mayor in charge of the water department because they wanted to make sure those problems didn't resurface. But the commission model isn't perfect. You have, it's not entirely efficient, and you don't know if the right people are going to be in charge. So 1912, the council manager system was discussed as a potential replacement just to make the system more effective. And that, nothing really happened out of that. It was just discussed, here's something that exists, maybe we should consider it. 1914, a group of people suggested, why don't we have a council manager? Why don't we have a city manager who runs the city? That would work pretty well. Nothing came of that either. It was just a proposal that nothing came of. But the important part is discussion was happening. The city was looking at how can we be more efficient? How can we make the government run more effectively? That was the question. Additionally, the main newspaper of the city, the Gazette, was running articles from 1915 on about how city managers were working in other cities. They were basically doing case studies and showing people, here's what's going on here and here and here. And from the 1912 article where they were a little confused, maybe the city manager wouldn't work too well. What if they had a bad person who didn't know what they were doing and they just ran the city into the ground? Their opinion started to change. And in 1917, a formal charter amendment to make the city under a council manager was brought up, went to election, and failed. The Gazette had actually endorsed that. That wasn't the end, though. A very similar amendment came up in 1920, proposed, let's put our system under a council manager. People agreed. They thought, okay, this is a good idea. Again, the Gazette endorsed that. They published mounds of articles saying, we should do this, we should do this, it will work. Interestingly, before A.M. Wilson was appointed that first mayor in June of 21, notice it took a little while from when they changed their system to when they appointed the manager. That was because the council, at this point, was 9 members. That was part of the change. Didn't know who to pick. They were really focused. One of the big conflicts was actually they wanted a resident of Colorado Springs to be their city manager. They thought someone who lived in the city would be able to best manage the city. And the argument against that, again, the Gazette put an editorial out that said, Council, you need to not worry about residency. The charter says pick the best person for the job regardless of other characteristics. So they appointed A.M. Wilson, non-resident, to run the city. Advance the slide. So that wasn't the end. We didn't just adopt the council manager system, do nothing until 2010 when we adopted the strong mayor, the mayor council. 1957, city council formed the Charter Revision Group. This Charter Revision Group looked over the entire charter. Their job was to find any problems in it, they would recommend even one-word changes to council for things that would clarify it, make it make more sense, have the whole thing work better. And eventually they did. I think it was 59. They decided, why don't we examine this council manager system? Is this the best way to run the city? They considered the other models available at the time, and did conclude the city manager would be the best option in the future. 74. And then again, there wasn't much charter discussion until 1974, when they formed the Charter Review Commission. And again, they reviewed the charter. Their first thought was, we can't really do anything about the charter until we examine the system it runs on. Do we want to stay with the council manager, or should we discuss mayor council? In fact, they held a town hall meeting, and there was a large group of people who showed up and discussed, we should switch to the mayor council because it would be more accountable and allow one person to control the city. They decided that there actually wasn't a very big public feeling for that, and suggested that the council manager system be retained. However, the next year, the charter change did come, and the mayor was no longer selected by council, but directly elected by the voters as an at-large representative. So again, things didn't happen for a while until 91. The 91 commission of review of the charter formed after a 5-year span where they were on their third manager. 2 in a row were replaced within those 5 years because of mismanagement, and people were getting worried that the city manager had too much power and was not accountable enough. However, the commission decided that's not true. Look at this. The council removed those managers, and now we have someone who's working. It works. Especially one of the things they brought up. They'd only had 9 managers in the 70 years the model had been running at that point. It was generally effective. The last 2 had just been an anomaly. Not much change until 95, when council members started being paid. Not much, but they were paid. 2004, a charter review committee was again formed to examine specifically, should we switch to a mayor-council model? This was 7 years before the actual change came. Their general agreement was that the mayor-council model put too much power into one person's hands, and that keeping a city manager who could be removed by a group of councilmen who had diffused power between them would be a more effective model. Next one. Until 2009 came. 2008 and 9, actually. The recession hit. Penelope Culbreth Graft was made city manager in January of 2008. She presided over basically the entire economic crisis. During her tenure, she had to make, in 18 months, she had to cut $40 million from the budget. And from what they could see from in looking at the 2010 budget, there were going to be an additional $25 million shortfall. Essentially, from what Mayor Lionel Rivera at the time said, the city couldn't provide the services they had with the amount of money they had. So council discussed how to make up that difference. They decided, without investigation to other taxes, that a property tax, a mill levy, would be able to cover that difference. It was an 8-1 decision by council with only one person against it that actually put that on the ballot. And that was called 2C. 2C would raise taxes for the average person by $126 its first year, and raise over time to $210 by its fifth and last year. Then voters were warned. There were going to be massive cuts if 2C actually failed. They were going to cut 35 fire department positions, 24 police departments. There were going to be 33 Parks and Rec positions eliminated, including visitor centers, the Rockledge Ranch Historical Site, that was an 1880s working ranch that was very popular, sees a lot of people within the city, and the Pioneers Museum, which is the center for basically local history. All the pools were going to be cut. They were going to cut community centers just to make up that difference. Additionally, They would stop maintaining parks, any mediums or public right-of-ways, and would cut the public transit system, which is already fairly meager, by 62,000 hours. So the one councilman who was against it, Tom Gallagher, suggested, you know, there's got to be a better way to make up this difference. So they investigated, or the Gazette demanded the city give them all of the payrolls, and they found out public employees made on average $61,000 compared to private employees in the county who made $41,000 on average. He thought, and the Gazette agreed, that that amount of money could be cut to make up the difference. Mayor Rivera at the time suggested that that was just a stopgap. They wouldn't be getting more money in the future, and it would just allow them to fill it in the next year, and then suddenly they'd have the massive cuts, have to have more cuts or raise the tax. So he suggested they couldn't just cut salaries, they had to approve 2C. But 2C failed. 63% of votes were cast against it that November. The city couldn't afford to keep providing things. First thing that happened, police had to reassign patrol officers to cover crimes and respond to problems. They worried that that would cause more traffic issues in the future and general issues. Next came cuts to the parks. They removed 400 trash cans from the parks right away in early 2010 and said in an official press release, citizens are asked to please pack out all trash. Additionally, those parks, the non-major parks, so not the big ones, not the big important ones, they weren't going to be watered, they weren't going to be mowed, they weren't going to be maintained in any fashion that following year because there wasn't the money for it. They cut 8,000 streetlights, just turned them off. Any of the ones that were deemed to be inefficient or near areas of ambient light from businesses or parking lots or anything that was privately done. And then people could pay to have them turned back on. So what you actually ended up seeing in a little bit was more wealthy neighborhoods had their lights on, the lesser ones didn't, and that wasn't exactly a good thing. So additionally, some of the important community functions that the city traditionally provides, like the community centers and actually the Rockledge Ranch historic site, they were funded privately. Rockledge Ranch originally would receive $150,000 from the city every year to run, and they had to raise that privately instead to continue running. They did. Additionally, a private church took over one of the community centers so people wouldn't lose access to that. Following this, in March of 2010, city manager Culbreth Graft resigned. This was actually following a council evaluation of her in which they said she was doing great. They thought, you're doing a good job, you're maintaining this economy as best you can, but she resigned. Scott Henty, a councilman, suggested that was because she was just burned out. She was drained, were his words, by the situation and the reaction people were having to it. They didn't like losing their services, even though they voted against the tax that would let them keep it. During her tenure, she ended up cutting a total of $90 million from the budget and 550 jobs. However, among that, there were no salary cuts. And that was one of the things that people didn't like, because as I mentioned earlier, salary cuts could have made up that budget difference, at least partly. Move on. So, also in March of 2010, a group called Citizens. Yes.
We're kind of running late, so if you could hit the high spots.
Sure, I'll speed up. Citizens for Accountable Leadership suggested the strong mayor plan. It was backed by real estate developers, and that went through in November. Next slide. So there were 8 candidates total. 3 of them were real estate developers, and ended up as a runoff with Steve Bach and Richard Storman. Steve Bach was one of the real estate developers. Scorman was a local businessman. He owned a few businesses in town. And Bach won the runoff 57.13%. This also changed how the council was elected. 6 district representatives, 3 at-large representatives. Mayor appoints the offices, and council approves them. And within 1 year, Bach replaced every position he was allowed to. However, council appoints the utilities board, acts as the board of directors for the Colorado Springs utilities. They also appoint the city auditor and runs general city enterprises. The mayor does not have influence on that. Next slide. Memorial Hospital problem. This is one of the case studies I brought up. Memorial Hospital was originally bought by the city in 1948 for $76,000, about $1 million in current money. They put together a commission and 2 task forces over the years to decide what to do with the hospital, because it lost $32 million in fiscal year 2008. Finally, they decided we'll send out requests for proposals and find out who can put together the best lease for the city. So University of Colorado Health System, wasn't called that at the time, but that's what it is now, same one that runs the Purdue Valley Hospital, selected to lease the system. So council had to negotiate the contract. They came up with, the original terms were $74 million up front and $5.6 million per year for 30 years. Mayor didn't like that. He thought he needed a voice in the negotiations. So he sent the city attorney in to it to make sure things happened. He gave a list of demands in the situation. And during the negotiating process, the CEO of Memorial Health System retired, or left, resigned, and he had an 18-month severance package, which was much larger than the typical severance package given to public employees. Bach told council they needed to do something about that because they had the right to vote out board members. He told them, make them change the severance or remove them entirely. The board didn't change the severance, council yanked them. Then, by the end of the negotiations, it was $74 million up front and $5.6 million a year for 30 years, like the original agreement. However, added on was $3 million a year to fund a new medical school at University of Colorado Springs. And they had, the UCH, University of Colorado Health, had to provide $185 million to resolve the para issue, because Memorial Health System employees were public. They were part of the Colorado pension plan for public employees, and to switch it to this system, who use their own pension plan, there was going to be a cost they had to pay to para. So University of Colorado Health had to cover that. And in August, it went to the voters to approve, which they did. Next slide. So then there's the Stormwater Task Force. So stormwater issues have been a pretty big problem in Colorado Springs. American Society of Civil Engineers gave an F rating for the infrastructure of stormwater in the area. For stormwater infrastructure, that's all the drainage systems. That's the where the water goes when it runs in the gutters, goes underground. It's the drainage ditches. It's how it gets off the mountains. It's what happens when it rains. How do you control that water? How do you make sure it doesn't damage anything? It wasn't doing well because there was no organization that directly managed stormwater. It was done piecemeal. Each city government had to manage its own stormwater. They used their own money to do it out of their general fund. There wasn't any money dedicated to doing this. From 2005 to 2009, it was called the Stormwater Authority, I think it was, 2005 to 2011, and it was voted out by the voters who called it a rain tax. So what's happening is there's nothing to fix the stormwater, and no one's willing to put the money towards it. So in August of 2012, they put together a stormwater task force. This stormwater task force came from the city council, the county commissioners, Colorado Springs Utilities involved, businessmen in the area, and general citizens. Just it was a group of people, not a formal thing, but it was no formal appointment or ratification, but it was put together to figure out what was going on and how to fix it. So in January of 2013, they've looked through all the stormwater problems. They figured out that there's about $90 million total to improve all the infrastructure in the region to just fix those stormwater problems in general. because they're looking at a regional view. That's why they had people from the county and other cities in the general area. And of that, they thought Colorado Springs would be responsible for between $580 and $800 million. The mayor invited them to his office before they gave this final presentation to anyone else to tell them, here's how much money it's going to cost, here's the projects we need. In it, he told them, I already have a plan for this. What we're going to do is we're going to raise sales tax and use that to pay for stormwater issues in Colorado Springs. I'd appreciate it if you don't tell anybody about this major price tag you came up with. They were told by the city attorney, and actually I think it was the chief of staff at the time, when he came in, that they were a mayor's task force. They needed to do what he wanted. However, the mayor didn't put together this task force. So they went forward and presented this information to council and to the other organizations. Bach hired an outside consultant to look over all this thing and make sure, because he thought this was a very high number and that was a little too much. That was CH2M Hill. Task Force at Colorado Springs had 78% of the issues. That's where those prices came from. So the task force figured out by this point that Colorado Springs would need to pay $790 million to fix all the stormwater issues in their area. CH2M Hill said it was actually $724 million. The task force said this would be best done through an $8 to $12 monthly fee that was essentially a property, that was done through property tax to cover the area. They would come up with a list of projects that money would go to fund. It would be called the Pikes Peak Rural Drainage Authority. By that summer, well, can we go to the next slide? By the next summer, they came up with the plan after Bach's own suggestion of using sales tax. Didn't go anywhere. No one liked the idea. It wasn't followed through on. Council endorses it. Originally, the idea was there'd be 11 members on this board total. 6 of them would be appointed from Colorado Springs. There would be 6 elected officials total that would come from currently elected officials. 4 of those would, I guess, be appointed by the council, and 2 would be appointed by the mayor. Bach said, that's not good enough. I need to be able to appoint 3 of these people, and they need to be non-elected, so he could appoint whoever he wanted to it. Council said, that's not going to happen. So Mayor Bach decided, okay, I'm going to publicly denounce this. It's not going to happen. It got put on the ballot anyway in November. Next slide. Yeah. That actually, in the end, it did fail in the voters, having that election passed. But that was because they modified their plans and it wasn't nearly as specific. There were other issues with it. So we see mayor and the council at odds here. There's the council who wants to do this. Mayor says, no, we're going to do this. They're fighting. It's tension, it's conflict, it's causing problems. So Keith King, who's currently the president of the council, came up with a few ideas. He called it the Strong Council to counter the strong mayor. He wanted council to be able to add and delete budget items. He wanted to reduce the total number of departments, or increase actually, that's wrong. He wanted to increase the total number of departments from 6 to 12, because if the mayor wanted to move money from department to department, the council had to approve it. 6 departments meant more money in each one. If they had 12, they had a little more control over him moving money from one area to another. They said this was to increase transparency. That way, people would know, because the budget, council said the budget is a promise. This is what we're going to use the money for, and it should be harder to change who's using that money. So by increasing the number of departments, forcing more approval of it, voters know that their money's not going to be spent willy-nilly. Finally, they wanted council to have its own staff, especially its own attorney, because as we saw in the Memorial Healthcare system, the attorney negotiated under Bach's terms for his goals to get the hospital together. The attorney was not working in the interest of the council or the city, but in the interest of the mayor. So they thought, Give us our own staff, that'll work in the interest of us, and that'll counter the problem of the staff working directly for the mayor. Next slide. So again, I bring this up because when Colorado Springs switched itself from the council manager to the mayor council, instead of really holistically creating a new system to run it, it just took the city manager and made the mayor the city manager and had people directly elect him. So we end up running into some issues with the checks and balances. Yes, the council can approve the mayor's appointments, but after that, they have no way to remove those appointments to council after they're selected. Additionally, the mayor doesn't have some checks on council, like we saw in the hospital situation. That enterprise, the board for the Memorial Health System, was run by the city council. They made the appointments, they decided whether to remove people or keep them or whatever. That was their prerogative. The mayor, his only job there was to sign the final lease. So there isn't a way for the mayor to check that because they also run the city utilities. Yeah, the mayor has no check on that. It was a hastily done situation, and those are where a lot of flaws come from. I see the next slide. So, flaws and solutions. We have the city staff working in the mayor's interest. So a solution, the council can have its own staff as proposed by King. Or you can increase accountability of the staff to council. My thought would be you have council have a manner to remove them from office. You have both the mayor and the council able to remove someone. They're going to work in the interest of the city, not of the mayor or of the council, and you won't have two attorneys fighting each other. I mentioned no mayoral influence on enterprises. Give him the ability to appoint to the enterprises. On utilities, have him be the 10th seat on the utilities board. Have him work with the council. Perhaps if the mayor is working with the council, they're going to be in less tension. They're going to be able to work together better because they have to, at least in some situations. There's creation of two city leaders. You have the council president, who is selected the same way the mayor was before 1975. Selected by the council to be in charge. The council president is almost like a second mayor. You have two people competing to be the voice of the city. And that's really unavoidable in a situation like this if you have a strong council.
Can I interrupt? So these solutions, these are the things that you're offering.
Right, these are things I'm offering in my analysis of what King proposed. Or you also increase the checks on the budget process. Like King suggested, allow them to add and delete budget items with the mayor's veto. And perhaps his idea to double the number of departments is wrong. Maybe that's not the way they break down. Maybe it'd be better to have 10 or 8. The general idea to allow increased accountability of where the money goes is a good one, but just doubling it is obscure. It'd be better to investigate where to break them better. Okay, the next slide. So conclusions. We got benefits of both. Council manager is professionally objective. They can work towards long-term goals, and as we saw from 85 to 91, when a manager is working wrong, the council can yank him, put him in a new person who's hopefully going to be better. In the mayor council system, we see mayoral leadership. The Memorial Healthcare System came out with a much better deal. It made sure there's going to be a med school there. Thanks to Bach's leadership, it wouldn't have happened without him. The management is supported by a professional staff. He has his chief of staff was the interim city manager and the former fire department chief who'd been working in the city government for years. They know how to run the city, so you didn't lose much that way. And if King's strong council proposals or similar ones are put through, they encounter the mayor's power. Next slide. There's flaws in both as well, though. The manager becomes overly focused on efficiency, or in the case of this, too connected to public employees and not to the city, because they're the people they work with. So that's what happened with Culbert's Graft. She didn't want to cut salaries. She preferred to find other cuts to reduce the services the city has instead. And as we mentioned earlier, professional is not always competent. They had to remove 2 people from 85 to 91 because they weren't doing their job right. You're not always going to have the right manager, and honestly, you're not always going to have the right council. Coming into this change, the council was weak. They weren't willing to remove a manager who didn't act the way the citizens wanted, to the point that they decided, let's change the system. Let's put someone in charge of the stuff that we can elect directly, because then we have more control of it. But the mayor-council model has its flaws as well. There's the conflict between the mayor and council, like we saw in the stormwater task force, and what may have happened in the health problem if the council had been stronger at the time. They were willing to do what the mayor said. Under King Council, they might not have. They might have said, hey, this is our job, get out of the way. Like we saw again in stormwater, the mayor's seeking power. He wanted more people he could appoint. He wanted to appoint a wider variety of people. And finally, this hasn't happened yet because the city's only had one mayor. You don't know if each individual mayor is going to be the same quality of governance. You don't know if they're going to appoint their friends. You don't know if they're going to appoint necessarily competent people. And you don't have it takes 4 years before you can replace them. From my assessment, I think if the city could switch back to a council manager, it would be a more effective means of governance. While the strong council might be able to fix some of the issues with it, it's going to be less efficient. You've got to have a whole other staff funded by the city, and then there's the chief of staff, and you end up losing whatever savings you have by having a mayor who's paid much less than the city manager. In terms of efficiency, the council manager's better. In terms of conflict, you don't have one group of people fighting for control of the city. It's better, and even in terms of responsiveness, it's better because the council can direct the manager to do something if it needs to happen. Now, does that mean this period was useless? No, it was an experiment. We got to see how can a strong mayor work? How can the mayor-council model work? What's wrong with our current council? It showed that you need a strong council. You need a group of people who are willing to remove someone from office if they have to. And that's the job of the voters, to put those people in. With that, are there any questions?
Would you like to go first?
Yeah.
Well,
One of the things that struck me as unusual about this situation is, usually when I think of people pressing for mayor, council form of government, what I know of it, it's usually been, I think, claiming that there's been kind of a depoliticization, that political issues aren't coming up, that we need, that there's been too much of it, in some sense, an administrative outlook on the part of government, and we essentially need more politics. We're not under the current system, we're not adequately, vetting the people's will here. But it seems like sort of the opposite was happening here, right? That the people that were looking to get this were thinking they would get better administration of a political selection, which seems to me like a rather odd thing. Now, so is that, am I right that there's sort of...
I see a little bit of it two ways, because we had a fairly passive there was a fairly passive council when it happened. The council wasn't being political. They weren't able to really do much. So you ended up with almost too much administration, and they thought, from what I could discern, that changed.
I forget, was this council, these were all at large originally?
Originally there were actually 5 district representatives and 3 at large. That's not right. 4 at large. There are 9 members total. And they increased the number of district representatives when the system changed.
The other thing that strikes me here is I mean, I wonder, I started looking at this and say, okay, you have all sorts of problems, you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic here, right? If you feel, you've got it. I mean, if I was sort of taking a step back, and I can't claim this is my special area of expertise, but it sort of seems to me like, okay, what you're talking about is how are you going to rearrange where the political inputs into the system are coming and the administrative inputs. And it seems to be shifting from one to another, just sort of rearranging the pieces there. It's not that, you know, if you think, I mean, you might take, I mean, look, just sort of for reaction as I think about it, because you know more about this situation than I do. But I mean, it strikes me sort of funny because, you know, even if you put in a mayor, obviously the mayor's not going to do all the day-to-day stuff. They're not going to have the budget experience. They're not going to have the you know, organizational experience that a city manager does. So somebody's going to be doing. It's not like that the work that a city manager. It's not like the mayor is actually going to take over all the stuff that a city manager formerly did. So, can you have a sense of what did and didn't get rearranged? I mean, do you think the mayor really did act like a manager, and then there was I mean, really did so I guess the question is sort of, did they really arrange the distribution of political and administrative
A little bit.
balance?
It almost feels to me with the chief of
I
staff.
don't know if
who-
that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. With the chief of staff has managerial
Was
experience.
the manager?
He was actually interesting. He was a resident who'd been in the city for a very long time. Actually, he was a native of the city.
Mhm.
But yeah, it goes from the council appointing someone who runs the city to the manager appointing someone. I mean, to the mayor who appoints someone who runs the city, but has a little more involvement directly in it.
So the mayor becomes sort of a little bit of a mixture, but I mean, if you thought of the mayor as a mixture of somebody, you know, a politician and an administrator, how would you see his mix? And this is not right, or, you know, this is not you, I'm not looking to trap you, I'm just
Right.
sort of curious.
Yeah, I didn't actually see a lot about the mayor directly doing things. He made appointments to people to run the departments, and I know he's very difficult to actually reach because he's busy, he does things, but we do see, it's almost like he provides oversight of everything. He's the guy who makes sure, oh, you're doing your job right, you're doing your job right, you're doing your job right. Oh, wait, we need to do that there, even if he doesn't know how to do it.
Which sounds a lot like manager to me. So, I mean, it's almost what you're describing is they got what they really had was just another city manager, in fact.
When you
That's what they
directly
call it.
elect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's all I have for the moment. I suppose I want to kind of think about it.
Well, you know, I was impressed by several things about the paper, but also about Colorado Springs. And one of the things that impressed me was that nobody's done a political history of Colorado Springs.
That I was able to find.
Yeah, well, there isn't it. I looked on WorldCat and there's nothing. You know, Colorado Springs is not an unimportant city. Aurora has a wonderful local history written by Stephen Mells, and you know, far lesser cities, cities of far lesser importance have histories, political histories written about them. And it's too bad because it's an important city. It's, you know, arguably, I think it's the second largest city in Colorado.
For population.
Yeah.
Aurora might be close.
And it's the second, and it's the core city of the second largest metropolitan area in this state, which kind of speaks to some of the regional issues that are implicit in the stormwater and the medical center thing as well. One of the things that struck me, it's also kind of one of the things that struck me in that same vein is that, you know, as a city manager city, when Ms. Culberth Graft became, this has to be a fairly big city in the city management pantheon of prestigious postings or assignments. And, you know, there used to be, used to be Dallas, Kansas City, were kind of the crown jewels of the city manager form of government. And I think Oakland went to a mayor when Jerry Brown became mayor of So there aren't, there are fewer of the crown jewels, but there are others of these large city manager cities. Aurora is one of them, Lakewood is another, Colorado Springs is another, and then they're all over the West. And it makes it, so Culberth Graff was there for 2 years. And one of the questions I had, not so much when I was reading it, but when I was listening to you talk, where did she go?
She explained in her resignation letter that she's planning on starting a private business to do consulting work and do lecture series.
But she's still in Colorado Springs?
As far as I know.
Interesting.
Didn't really do it more.
Well, it had to have been a shock to her to deal with the things that she was had to deal with. That would be a real come down for any up-and-comer city manager on the move,
It's funny because we saw a lot of parallels in the university.
We see parallels
somebody
in the
gets a big administrative job in the university, they come in during a period of budget crisis, and they say, oh boy, this wasn't as much fun as I thought.
Why did I come here?
I don't know what the average salary is for city managers. I know in Colorado Springs it was $210,000. I don't know if that's...
That's about normal.
Okay, so...
Maybe a little low for a city of that size.
Yeah.
So, anyway. The other, but kind of along the lines of what Professor Lacey was saying, I see a certain irony here too, that Mayor Bache seems to have prevailed and done a fairly good job in some rather atypical policies. The stormwater and the city hospital these are policy managers that are sort of extraordinarily in their institutional scope and in just the money involved, if nothing else, but also the importance of having a medical school or a medical center or a big hospital in a city like that. You can't be a Colorado Springs without having a decent sized hospital or two, and you can't be a city in the West without solving your stormwater, the regional problem of stormwater. But on the other hand, those aren't the things that seem to be vexing the city now. Those issues are over, as I understand it. And
well, actually, the stormwater is the enterprise failed, so they're still trying to figure out a way to handle it.
So that it failed in the recent election.
Yep.
Yeah. So they're going back to the drawing board to try to find a different organizational structure that will accomplish a majority within the regional catchment of the electorate.
Part of the problem with it was the property tax it had was much higher on businesses, so a fairly large business community really didn't like it.
Yeah. So, but they're having problems with the normal stuff. The relationship between the council president and the mayor seems to be contentious, and it's not over big stuff, but all the little stuff. So that's kind of another kind of difference, a thing that I see is we're doing better on the big stuff than we are on the little stuff in terms of contentiousness, at least within the city. So the city has, but I really I learned something about the city manager's weaknesses in providing some sort of muscularity to the leadership in these sort of big policy arenas or big policy changes, large-scale policy changes, I guess you could call them. That it means the city manager is kind of weak unless the city manager is able to tap into some kind of leadership cabal or organize some kind of coalition, whether issue by issue or globally across all the panoply of city policies. The city manager is not very well suited to do that kind of coalition building and so forth, unless they can do that. So it's kind of an institutional weakness. And just a kind of a comment, in Fort Collins, one of the things that happens is that when we get into large-scale policy making, the city manager creates some sort of transgalactic commission. Then they meet for a year, and everybody's friends and friends of friends, and everybody who's interested in recreation or real estate or bike paths or whatever is involved in this, and they present the whole thing as a package to the voters. And this is one of I call this accessorization of the city manager form of government, when the way that the city manager is able to be political that is, exert political leadership, is to create these commissions, try to get the right people on them, try to manage what they come up with, and then keep everybody herded together in one clump so that they can, pass a bond issue, or like they recently did with in the county anyway, and the city too with the recreational fees and stuff, recreational tax. It makes me think that the city manager down in Colorado Springs, the ones that they had were not really good at doing that sort of extra charter political work that it takes, like Fort Collins. Fort Collins is kind of regarded as a real model, and having leadership where the charter really provides for very little, but the city managers have to innovate and they have to go out and so forth. So let's see, what's my question? I gotta have a question for you. Is this just a kind of accumulation of a bunch of transitory events? It seems like we have transitory stuff, the 2008 recession, a transitory event that forced, that kind of, some people rode on this wave of dissatisfaction, and it's still not clear to me whether this could have happened without the charter change could have happened without the recession. And now you have this conflict between, and I don't know how rancorous it is or how serious it is, between Keith King, who's a fairly, assertive and ambitious guy on the one hand, leading the council, and then Bache, who's no shrinking violet himself. But to have that kind of, that stature of a city council president seems really anomalous. So, here we have something caused by an anomaly, a charter change caused by an anomaly, but it's being operationalized by a kind of an anomalous, conflict. I guess. What do you think? Is there a?
I feel like it was a chain of events.
Yeah.
Yes, the anomalous economic situation caused what had been a sort of like an underground idea of a mayor. A strong mayor would be better. That had been around for decades at that point, to be able to surface and through the initiative become fact instead. Because people saw the passive council not doing anything. Figure we put someone strong in, then we'll get the job done. So that changed that. Then Bach's leadership, and he had other initiatives that he's been working on that weren't so positive. They wanted to move the stadium for the local AAA baseball team downtown, for example. That was called the City of Champions, and it was all connected to the Olympic Training Center as well. There's also, Bach's also done a lot with the downtown area. He has a big focus on that hasn't, so the rest of the city hasn't seen it so much. So I feel like someone powerful, someone strong like King got in as a reaction to the strength of the mayor. The council got stronger because the mayor was stronger.
Interesting.
What do you think the real estate interests really wanted to get out of this form of government? I presume it was, my take is they're, presumably they were pursuing policy ends by thinking, if we swap this structure, we'll get a different set of policies. You have so much what they really didn't like about what was happening?
I think they're just looking for someone who could, a way to get someone of them in direct power to help.
So it's really just, this would give us more, this would be a system in which we've got a chance to get our own mayor in there.
And the real estate developers have been important since the beginning. They
usually do have a conflictual relationship.
Because, that original group that put together, that examined to create the home rule charter had members of the real estate.
So interesting. So they did want to politicize this, but in their own.
And I thought it was interesting. I skimmed over this in the presentation. About 80% of the funding for the campaign to pass issue 300 came from one developer, from the Norwood Group, from the guy who ran it.
These other guys, though, there were two other developers that got a fair chunk of votes. In the 20% range.
Yeah. Again, this is the irony of it, because I usually hear people talk about, city manager forms of government get captured by outside interests, and the politics of a mayor system prevents that. This is the opposite situation, was an attempt to capture. That's interesting.
Well, you know, the two things that you described, the downtown development and the moving it's sort of rearranging this sort of amateur and professional sports complex, these are all large-scale institutional policy things that, you know, fit the mayor's brand, if you want to put it that way, a lot better than the city manager. But,
I just think about another anomaly came up. So the council at the time before Thesis passed was, the economy is not going to bounce back, we're not going to get more money right away. They were wrong. That's why I didn't really talk about budget issues after he took power. The economy bounced back, at least in the springs, in terms of tax revenue, fairly quickly, and those budget problems weren't around in the same way.
you know, people usually say that Colorado Springs doesn't have budget problems because, and you know, nobody's ever done a study, so you know, why should we believe them? But because of all the dependency on defense spending and so forth, that the payrolls don't collapse like they do in Allentown, Pennsylvania, for example. If the, you know, it's a one. Some people have described it. It's a one industry town, and that industry never collapses. You know, and I think Ann Marcus in her book called "Cities of the Gun Belt," she did a case study on Colorado Springs as an example of this defense spending, military bases, R&D is what keeps Colorado Springs sort of different from the rest of the state. So was this all this was all from the collapse of a property tax bubble or a housing bubble, or?
Yeah, I'm not entirely
It
sure,
bears
but
further-
what happened was there was a big drop in revenue that year, and the Tabor ratchet is what brought the budget so low for the next year, because they brought in so little revenue.
Oh, so it's an artifact of the Tabor ratchet,
Right.
For the
And then
for the property, for the schools in the city. Interesting.
Because Colorado Springs it's got a slightly more strict Tabor than the state, because it was the
Oh,
origin
yeah.
of Tabor.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. So in a sense, this is, in part, it's kind of institutionally provoked,
And
rather than, economically provoked.
And culturally, the taxes generally don't pass unless it's for a very specific reason. Like the PPRDA, the Stormwater Enterprise Task Force I came up with, was based on what's called the PPRTA, the Regional Transport Authority, that it's a sales tax, I think, 1 cent, something like that, that has very specific projects it goes to fix regional transport issues, and that was supported. But the more vague and the property tax on the stormwater situation didn't.
Yeah. Interesting. So that was going to be a regional property tax.
For the city, just the city.
Oh, just the city. And then how were the other cities in the county going to kick in?
I didn't know they would do that.
Yeah.
That would have been their problem.
Yeah, that's all. It's Colorado Springs is one media market, so you'd think it would be easier to sell a regional issue there than would, the Fort Collins, Greeley, Loveland triangle, because they're not. And get everybody on the same page. This will cost you half a cent a year for 30 years to fix all the stormwater problems. I think that would be
Right.
If
something worked like that for the
political
stormwater,
consulting.
but it was like $8 to $12 a month for the average citizen. It was up to like $50 a month for businesses.
Yeah, it's a lot. Well, though I think the stormwater thing is a soluble problem. It's just they have to send all these different options through the tumbler to find out which holes fit in which blocks fit in which holes the best. Well, the Tabor angle is really interesting.
And you think of with a relatively transient, people coming through on our military appointments and whatnot, that's going to be tougher to produce tax revenue.
Well, the turnout really surprised me. 60-some%.
Yes,
in the,
it was very. There were mail-in ballots. All mail-in ballots. Everybody got. Not November, but for the April and May elections, those were all mail-in ballots, and the same way for the hospital one. Just everybody who was registered, and that was of the registered to vote people. Is what that turnout was.
Interesting. Well, somebody should really do a book on Colorado Springs because it's pretty interesting. And now when you have all these, unemployed former legislators that have been turned out, like Keith King, it's going to make things interesting.
You know, I gotta get the stuff.
And the second mayor election is this May,
Yeah.
this March-ish.
Yeah, that'll be interesting
April.
to see. Are there any rivals? Is Keith King going to run?
I don't think so,
Mhm.
but there are other people running. A former popular mayor from when it was manager council, Mary Lou Makepeace, I've heard is running. And there's people don't know yet if Bach's planning on running for re-election or not. Haven't really announced yet.
The other thing that struck me when you were speaking, that didn't struck me when I was reading it, is A.M. Wilson, the first city manager. He was not from Colorado Springs. What was his profession, do you know?
I honestly couldn't find anything. I had to deduce that he wasn't from the Springs
Yeah.
because it was within days after the Gazette said, pick someone who's not a resident, that they picked someone.
Some of the early work from the 1940s that looks at the record of city manager governments talk about how the first generation of city managers all tended to be civil engineers, almost to the exclusion of 96, 97%. Yeah. Well, the other thing that impressed me is the commission thing. Galveston had just adopted the commission form as the businessman's charter after the Galveston flood, after the hurricane down there. And it quickly collapsed because it turned into 5 different